Georgia, 1848. The air before dawn was thick with damp heat, the kind that settled into the skin and stayed there no matter how still one stood. The slave quarters lay quiet. Rows of low wooden cabins crouched like tired animals at the edge of the plantation. Most of the people inside them were asleep, or pretending to be, their bodies worn down by labor and fear in equal measure. But wait for a second before we continue towards the video. Let us know in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. Etta was awake, she always was. Sleep came to her in fragments, short, shallow moments broken by memory, by sound, by the constant awareness that her body did not belong to her. She sat on the edge of the narrow pallet, back straight, hands resting loosely in her lap, listening to the night as if it might speak. Crickets sang, frogs croaked from the distant marsh. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and then went quiet. She rose slowly, careful not to make the floorboards creak. The cabin smelled of old wood, sweat, and smoke from the cooking fire that never quite aired out. She tied a faded cloth around her hair, not for beauty but habit, then slipped outside. The sky was still dark, but the stars were fading. Dawn would come soon, and with it the bell. Etta walked toward the back of the quarters where the cane tools were stacked under a lean-to roof. She had permission to fetch them early. The masters liked her strength and her silence. She worked harder than most, spoke less than anyone. That combination made her useful. Useful meant watched. She lifted a cane knife from the pile. Its blade was long and curved, dulled by years of cutting but still heavy, still sharp enough if one knew where to aim. She balanced it in her hand, feeling its weight. Tools told the truth. They never pretended to be anything else. Etta had been born on this land, or close enough to it that she could not remember a time before the red Georgia dirt stained her feet. Her mother had died when Etta was young, worked into the ground by cotton and childbirth. Her father had been sold south when she was 9. After that, the world had narrowed to commands, punishments, and the careful learning of how to survive without being noticed too much. But Etta had been noticed anyway. By 14, she was taller than most of the women. By 16, stronger. By 18, men began to look at her differently, not as a worker, but as something else. Something they believed they could take. She learned early what those looks meant. She learned to keep her eyes down, her face blank. She learned when to move and when to stay still. She learned that screaming rarely helped. The masters called her that quiet one. The overseers called her trouble waiting. The other slaves called her nothing at all when white ears were near, but when they whispered among themselves, her name carried weight. Etta. Not loud, not friendly, not broken. The plantation belonged to the Caldwell family, 3 generations rooted into the land like old trees. The current master, Thomas Caldwell, was a man who liked order. He liked seeing rows straight, backs bent, heads lowered. He rarely got his hands dirty himself, preferring to let overseers enforce his will. One of those overseers was named Harris. Harris had arrived 2 years earlier, hired from another county after the previous man drank himself into uselessness. Harris was younger, meaner, eager to prove himself. He carried his authority like a weapon, always ready to swing it. From the moment he noticed Etta, something in his eyes had changed. At first it was small things, standing too close, calling her back after a task was finished, letting his gaze linger longer than necessary. Etta felt it every time, the way prey feels a predator before the attack comes. She adjusted her routines. She avoided being alone when possible. She stayed near older men, near children, near daylight. But the plantation did not belong to her. Time did not belong to her. Her body did not belong to her. That truth pressed down on her now as she carried the cane knife toward the fields, the sky beginning to pale. She worked until the bell rang again for breakfast, cutting through stalks with practiced movements, her muscles moving almost on their own. Sweat slicked her skin. Her mind stayed sharp. When the sun climbed higher, Harris appeared on horseback, riding the line of workers. He slowed when he reached her. "You," he said. Etta did not look up. She kept cutting. "I said you." She stopped and turned, eyes lowered. "Yes, sir. Master wants the fence checked on the west edge. Take your knife and go." Her stomach tightened. The west edge bordered the woods. Fewer eyes there. Fewer witnesses. "Yes, sir." She walked away without hurry, every step measured, Panic wasted energy. Panic led to mistakes. The fence line stretched long and uneven, posts leaning where rot had eaten through the wood. Beyond it, the forest loomed dark and dense. Cicadas screamed from the trees. Etta bent to examine a loose rail, testing it with one hand.
"You work awful hard," Harris said behind her. She straightened slowly. "I do what I'm told."
He dismounted. The horse snorted and stamped. "Ain't that the truth?" he said, smiling in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know, a woman like you could get special treatment, make life easier." She said nothing. He stepped closer. Too close. His hand brushed her arm. That was when something inside her shifted. It wasn't sudden, not really. It was the result of years layered one on top of another. Loss, fear, humiliation, watching other women dragged away and returned hollow-eyed. It was the knowledge that this moment would not be the last if she let it pass. She moved before thought could stop her. Her hand tightened around the cane knife. She turned fast, bringing the blade up in a sharp arc. Harris's smile vanished, replaced by confusion. He tried to speak. He didn't get the chance. The blade struck where she aimed, just below the ribs. She felt resistance, then a give. Warmth splashed her hand. He staggered back, eyes wide, mouth opening and closing without sound. She pulled the knife free and struck again, driven by something fierce and cold. He fell to his knees, then onto his side, blood darkening the dirt. For a moment the world went very quiet. Etta stood there, chest heaving, heart hammering against her ribs. Her hands shook, but she did not drop the knife. She stared at the body, waiting for something, shouting, footsteps, judgment from the sky itself. Nothing came. Then she heard voices. Someone was calling from the fields. Someone had noticed Harris's horse standing alone. Etta wiped the blade on the grass, turned and ran. She did not run toward the quarters. She ran toward the back paths she had memorized as a child, the narrow trails used by those who knew how to move unseen. Branches clawed at her dress. Roots threatened to trip her. She kept going. Behind her, shouts rose. Harris's body lay cooling in the dirt, and the plantation would not stay quiet for long. Etta did not know what came next. She only knew there was no going back. Etta ran. She did not think about direction at first, only distance. Every step was driven by the pounding of her heart and the raw burn in her lungs. The forest swallowed her quickly, the tall pines and thick undergrowth closing in behind her like a door slamming shut. Branches snapped beneath her feet, leaves slapped against her face, and roots reached out of the dirt as if to trip her. She kept the cane knife clenched in her right hand. Its weight was familiar, grounding. The handle was slick now, not just with sweat. She did not look at it. Looking would make it real in a way she was not ready to face. Behind her, voices rose. "Over here! Harris! Find her!" The shouts cut. Through the trees, sharp and panicked. Horses neighed. Dogs barked. They had found him. Etta pushed harder, her body responding without complaint. She had worked these lands since she could walk. She knew which ground dipped suddenly, which patches hid snakes, which paths twisted back on themselves. She veered left, then right, doubling back once before plunging deeper into the woods. Her breath came in ragged pulls now. Smoke burned her chest, not from fire but from fear and effort combined. Her legs screamed for rest. She ignored them. Stopping meant dying. She reached a narrow creek and splashed through it without slowing, water soaking her skirt and shoes. She climbed the far bank, slipping once, scraping her palm against a rock. Pain flared. She welcomed it. Pain meant she was still moving. The woods grew darker as the canopy thickened. Sunlight broke through only in thin, shifting strips. Etta slowed just enough to listen. Dogs. She could hear them now, low, eager sounds carried on the air. She angled away from the creek, then doubled back again, forcing her trail to cross itself. Her mind worked fast, sharp. She tore a strip from her dress and tied it around her bleeding palm, then rubbed dirt over the blood on the knife handle. She could not erase herself. She could only confuse them. The ground ahead sloped downward into a shallow ravine choked with ferns and fallen branches. Etta slid into it and crouched low, forcing her breathing to slow. Every sound felt too loud. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. Memories pressed in when she stopped moving. Harris's face, the way surprise had overtaken arrogance in a single breath. Her stomach twisted. Not with regret, she did not have space for that, but with the weight of knowing what she had done. A white man lay dead by her hand. There was no forgiveness for that. No trial, no mercy, only punishment. She pushed the thought away and crawled through the ravine, staying low until the land rose again on the far side. She climbed, hands gripping roots, mud smearing her arms. At the top she paused, scanning the forest. Nothing. She moved again. Time stretched strangely after that. Minutes felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, its heat pressing down through the trees. Sweat soaked her dress. Her throat burned with thirst. The sounds of pursuit faded, then returned, then faded again. She did not know how long she ran. Eventually her body began to slow her whether she wished it or not. Her legs trembled, her vision blurred at the edges. She stumbled once, caught herself against a tree and leaned there for a heartbeat too long. She forced herself onward. By late afternoon she reached the edge of a swamp. The air changed instantly, thicker, wetter, buzzing with insects. The ground turned treacherous, sucking at her feet with every step. Tall grasses and cypress knees rose from murky water. The smell of rot hung heavy. Etta hesitated only a moment before stepping in. Swamps were dangerous. Snakes, quicksand, getting lost. But dogs hated them. She waded forward, water rising to her calves, then her knees. Leeches clung to her skin. She ignored them. She moved slowly now, deliberately, breaking as few reeds as possible. She used her knife to cut through vines, careful to leave no clear path. A sound reached her ears, faint, distant, a horn. They were organizing now. Etta pushed deeper into the swamp until the water reached her waist. She found a fallen log thick with moss and eased herself onto it, lying flat along its length. The bark scratched her cheek. She pressed her face down, breathing shallowly. Mosquitoes descended immediately, whining around her ears, biting any exposed skin. She did not swat them. She waited. Minutes passed. Then she heard the dogs again, closer this time. Their barks were sharper, more excited. Men shouted commands. They went this way. She's headed into the muck. The dogs reached the edge of the swamp and balked. Whining. One ventured in and yelped, snapping back at something unseen. The men cursed. Etta closed her eyes. Her muscles shook with exhaustion. Every instinct screamed to move, to flee again, but she forced herself to remain still. Movement would give her away. A man's voice carried over the water. She won't last long in there. Another laughed. Don't matter, we'll flush her out. They began probing the swamp's edge with sticks, firing shots into the trees to scare her. Each crack of the gun made her flinch. She tasted bile. The sun began to sink, shadows lengthening. As darkness crept in, the men's voices grew more frustrated. The dogs tired. The swamp resisted them in ways fields and roads did not. Finally a horn sounded again, different this time. A signal. Pull back, someone shouted. We'll take her in the morning. Boots retreated. Voices faded. The swamp slowly returned to its own sounds. Etta stayed where she was long after silence fell. When she finally moved, it was inch by inch. She slid off the log into the water, suppressing a gasp at the cold. She waded deeper, then angled sideways, increasing the distance between herself and the edge. Night fell fully. The swamp at night was alive. Frogs croaked loudly. Insects screamed. Something splashed nearby, unseen. Etta found a small rise, a patch of ground barely above water level, and climbed onto it. She crouched there, hugging her knees, knife across her lap. Her body began to shake, not from cold alone. The reality of what she had done settled fully now, heavy and unavoidable. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Even if she escaped tonight, tomorrow, next week, she would always be hunted. She pressed her forehead against her knees. She thought of her mother's hands, rough and warm, of her father's laugh, faint but remembered, of other women she had known, dragged away screaming. A quiet resolve hardened in her chest. If this was the price of refusing to be touched, she would pay it in full. She did not sleep. At first light she would move again, because surviving one night was not enough. Dawn did not arrive gently. It crept in like a thief, thin light sliding between the cypress trunks, turning the swamp from black to grey, then slowly to a dull, sickly green. Mist hovered low over the water, curling around tree knees and broken reeds as if the land itself were exhaling. Etta was awake before the light reached her. She had not slept. Her eyes burned and ached, her head throbbing with a dull, persistent pain that matched the pounding of her heart. Every muscle in her body felt tight, coiled, ready to snap. When she shifted her weight even slightly, pain flared through her calves and lower back. She welcomed the pain. It meant she was still alive. She crouched on the small rise of ground where she had stayed through the night, her skirt stiff with dried mud and swamp water. Leeches clung to her legs, swollen and dark. She peeled them off one by one, jaw clenched, smearing them into the muck without a sound. The knife lay across her lap. She had not let go of it once. The swamp was louder in daylight. Birds called sharply from unseen branches, frogs quieted, replaced by insects that buzzed and whined. Somewhere deeper in the water, something large moved, sending ripples outward. Etta listened. At first, she heard nothing human. No voices, no dogs, no horns. That did not mean they were gone. She waited until the light strengthened, then slowly straightened, joints protesting. She tested her legs, shifting her weight carefully. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she froze, breathing through it until the world steadied again. She could not stay here. The men had pulled back last night, but they would return. With more people, more dogs, more patience. She needed to move before they did. Etta eased herself off the rise and into the shallow water again, moving slowly, deliberately. She did not wade straight out. Instead, she angled deeper into the swamp, choosing a path that forced her to step over submerged roots and through thick patches of reeds. Each step was calculated, meant to leave as little trace as possible. The mud sucked at her feet, threatening to steal her shoes. She let them go when one finally slipped off, leaving it behind without hesitation. Barefoot was quieter, faster. Her stomach growled, sharp and insistent. She ignored it. Hunger was familiar. Fear was louder. As she moved, memories surfaced unbidden. The first time Harris had spoken to her alone. The way he had leaned against a fence post, smiling as if they shared a joke. The way his eyes had followed her hands instead of her face. She pushed the image away. The swamp began to thin after what felt like hours. The ground grew firmer beneath her feet, the water retreating into shallow pools. Trees gave way to low brush and open patches of grass. Etta slowed at the edge, crouching low. She scanned the land ahead carefully. Beyond the last line of trees lay a narrow strip of open ground leading toward another plantation's fields. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, morning fires, breakfast being cooked, people, danger, opportunity. She stayed hidden, watching, listening. A sound drifted to her ears, dogs again. Faint but unmistakable. They were closer than she had hoped. Etta turned away from the fields and slipped back into cover, moving parallel instead of forward. She kept low, using the brush to break her outline. Her breath came shallow now, controlled. The dogs' voices grew clearer. She could hear men shouting commands, their voices sharper, more focused than the day before. This was no longer confusion or shock. This was a hunt. Her name would not be spoken, only words like her, it, that won. Etta moved faster, ignoring the ache in her legs. She followed a narrow game trail that curved through the trees, her feet landing softly on packed earth instead of leaves. She ducked under low branches, slid past thorny bushes, blood blooming in thin lines along her arms where thorns caught her skin. She did not stop. The trail led to a shallow ravine, dry and shadowed. She dropped into it and followed its winding path, using its curves to hide her movement. When it ended abruptly at a fallen tree, she climbed over and continued on the far side. The dogs were close now. She could hear their panting, their excited barks. The men's voices rose and fell, fragments carried on the air. "She's still ahead of us. Spread out." Etta's chest tightened. She needed something, anything, to break their rhythm. Her eyes caught on a line of old fencing ahead, half collapsed and overgrown. She veered toward it, ducking through a gap and dragging herself through briars on the other side, leaving fabric behind. She kept moving for several minutes, then circled back, careful and quiet, and crossed her own path at a sharp angle before doubling back again. The dogs reached the fence and erupted in confusion, noses down, circling wildly. Men cursed. Etta did not wait to see if it worked. She ran again, lungs burning, vision narrowing. She burst from the trees onto a narrow dirt road, froze for a heartbeat, then crossed it in a flash and vanished back into cover on the other side. Hoofbeats sounded almost immediately. She pressed herself flat against the ground beneath a thick bush, knife ready. A horse passed so close she could smell its sweat, hear the leather creak as the rider shifted. The rider slowed. Etta held her breath. The horse snorted, tossing its head. The man muttered something, then urged it forward. Only when the sound faded did she allow herself to breathe again. Her body trembled now, exhaustion finally demanding its due. She could not keep this pace forever. By midday the sun beat down hard, burning away the last of the morning mist. Heat pressed in from all sides. Her mouth was dry, her tongue thick. She found a shallow creek. ND drank cautiously, aware of the risks but desperate. The water was cool and tasted of earth. She splashed some on her face, washing away sweat and grime. She did not linger. The land rose slightly ahead, the trees thinning again. Etta slowed, scanning carefully. She spotted a small, abandoned shack tucked into a stand of trees, a hunter's shelter, old and half-collapsed. She hesitated. Shelter meant rest, rest meant risk, but her legs were shaking now, and her vision swam when she stood still. She crept closer, circling once to check for signs of recent use. There were none. The door hung crooked on one hinge. Inside, the floor was dirt, the roof patched with rotting boards. Etta slipped inside and pressed herself into the far corner, knife raised. She waited. Nothing happened. She lowered herself slowly to the ground, back against the wall. The moment she stopped moving, the world tilted. She closed her eyes, fighting it, but her body finally claimed its due. She slept. Not deeply, not peacefully. She woke at the slightest sound, a bird landing on the roof, a branch cracking in the distance. Each time she jolted upright, heart racing, knife ready. Hours passed like this, rest broken into fragments. When she finally stirred fully, the light had softened again, slanting low through the gaps in the walls. She had gained little strength, but it was something. She stood carefully, stretching stiff muscles. Hunger gnawed at her now, sharp and insistent. She needed food. Soon, she stepped out of the shack and froze. Footprints, fresh, not hers. Her pulse spiked. She scanned the trees, senses screaming. A voice spoke behind her. "Well now." Etta spun, knife up. A man stood a short distance away, hands raised slightly, palms open. He was older, grey threaded through his hair, his clothes plain but clean, not dressed like an overseer, not armed, at least not visibly. "Easy," he said. "I ain't here to hurt you." Etta did not lower the knife. "You shouldn't be here," he continued quietly. "They're looking for you." Her grip tightened. "I know who you are," he said, "and I know what they'll do if they catch you." Silence stretched between them, heavy and dangerous. Etta did not speak. The man glanced around, then back at her. "You can't stay here, but if you want to live through the night, you'll need help." The dogs barked again in the distance, closer. Etta's jaw set. She did not know if this man was a lifeline or another trap, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Standing still meant death. The man's voice, calm yet firm, carried through the half-light of the early morning, but Etta could hear the faint echo of chaos behind him. Shouts, barking, hooves pounding over distant dirt paths. She did not move, knife still raised, fingers trembling with fatigue and alertness. "I said, I'm not here to hurt you," the man repeated. He held his hand slightly higher now, as if that would convince her. His clothes were plain, his eyes steady and unafraid, but there was a weight to his gaze, a depth that told her he understood the world she had been forced into, more than anyone she had ever met in this region. Her mind raced. Every instinct screamed that she could not trust him. Strangers were almost always a threat, and she had been betrayed more times than she could count. Yet somewhere under the dread, under the exhaustion, there was a spark of hope, a faint, fragile thread. Why help me?" she whispered, voice dry, hoarse from yesterday's run and the night of swamp crawling. "Because," he said slowly, choosing his words, "you're not meant to be hunted like an animal, not like this." His eyes flicked briefly toward the swamp. "You didn't just defend yourself, you scared them. They've started whispering about you. The masters, the overseers, they're afraid now." Etta's chest tightened. Afraid. She had never heard that word applied to white men before. Fear, like fire, could spread quickly, consuming reason. The thought startled her. Could they really fear her? Could she really have power, real power, even if only a little? The man extended a hand. "I know a place. Not far from here, safe. You'll rest. You'll eat. You'll gain strength." Etta's mind calculated risks, seconds stretching like hours. Each option, trust him, refuse him, run blindly back into the swamp, carried consequences she might not survive. Finally, she lowered her knife just slightly, enough to indicate she was listening. "Lead," she said, voice cautious, wary. He nodded, not pressing further. Careful, don't draw attention, stay in the shadows, move with the brush. Together they moved slowly through the thinning woods. The man had knowledge of the land, paths invisible to anyone who hadn't lived and moved through them. He led her along old game trails, under branches, around small creeks that would leave tracks. Every step was deliberate, silent. Etta marveled at how quiet he moved, as if the forest itself obeyed him. She felt almost absurdly exposed, even with his guidance. Every sense was heightened, the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the occasional call of a bird, all warning, all signals. By mid-morning they arrived at the outskirts of a small clearing. In the center was a dilapidated cabin, almost swallowed by wild overgrowth. Vines clung to the roof, the windows were cracked, smoke curled faintly from the chimney, hinting at life within. "You'll be safe here," the man whispered, "but stay alert. No one knows you're coming, and I can't stay long." Etta stepped forward, her legs still shaking, heart hammering. She passed the threshold and peered inside. It was sparsely furnished, one table, a few chairs, a bed in the corner. A fire had been started and was smoldering, sending faint tendrils of smoke upward. Inside, she allowed herself a brief moment to drop to the floor, pressing her face to the dirt. The exhaustion hit her fully now, a tidal wave of muscle pain, hunger and fear. Her hands shook as she tried to clean the grime from her face. She could smell the lingering iron of blood from the past 24 hours. The man knelt beside her, but kept his distance. "You need food," he said gently. "Some bread, a bit of meat. You'll need your strength. And water." Etta nodded, too weak to speak. He moved silently, returning with a small bundle of food and a flask of water. She ate slowly, tasting every crumb and sip, aware of how long it had been since she had anything real inside her body. While she ate, the man spoke softly. "You've become a legend," he said. "Not out of pride, but out of fear. They whisper your name now. 4 men tried to take you in the past weeks. 4, and you stopped them all." Etta froze. 4? "Yes," he said. "They've started whispering in the quarters, in the fields. They speak in fear of you now. Not the way they speak of the others. They talk differently, carefully, quietly, afraid." Etta felt something strange in her chest. Power, perhaps, but fear, even fear of her, carried a weight she had never known. They had underestimated her. They had counted on her submission, her quietness, and they had been wrong. Every corner of the plantation that had once been dangerous now seemed different in her mind, reshaped by what she had done. Her gaze fell on the knife lying across her lap. Its edge was still clean. Her hands itched to hold it again, to feel that familiar weight. But she forced herself to rest. The man seemed to understand, his gaze softening slightly. "Rest now. Soon you'll need to move again. They'll come looking, and not just the men you've already dealt with. Word spreads fast when fear is involved." Hours passed like this. Etta slept in short bursts, eyes fluttering open at every sound, every rustle outside the cabin. She dreamed in fragments. Visions of the swamp, the sound of the cane knife hitting its target, Harris falling, the faces of the others who had touched her AG. Against her will, twisting in surprise and pain. Each dream left her shaking, a cold sweat clinging to her skin. When she awoke fully again, the man was gone. He had left quietly, leaving the cabin empty but with a small stack of extra food and water. Etta rose cautiously, testing her muscles, flexing her fingers. She was bruised, scraped, exhausted, but alive. She thought of the plantation, of Harris, of the others. Fear had become a shield, yes, but also a chain. She could not stay here forever. The moment she stepped back into the open world, she would be hunted again. Each step, each breath could bring them closer. Etta moved toward the door, pausing to listen. Silence. The swamp beyond stretched in hazy light, shadows of trees dancing in the early afternoon sun. She stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun on her bruised arms, on her mud-streaked face. For the first time in over a day, she could breathe without immediate panic. Her mind raced ahead. The fear in her chest was mingled with determination now. She had stopped them once, twice, thrice. She had survived. And if they came again, she would stop them again. The masters had assumed they could break her body, her will. They were wrong. She thought of the whispers. Fear. That intangible weight that made their hearts tighten when they spoke of her. That fear could be weaponized. She could be a shadow, a ghost they could not touch, and every attempt to capture her would leave them weaker, trembling, her lips pressed together, and she smiled faintly. Not out of joy, not because life was easy, but because she knew finally that she could survive. She could fight, and she could teach them all a lesson they would never forget. The shadows lengthened as afternoon moved toward evening. Etta gathered herself, tying the wet hair from her face into a tighter knot. She cleaned the mud and blood from her knife as best she could with rags she found in the cabin. Every detail mattered. Every carelessness could cost her life. She knew her next move had to be precise. Outside, the land stretched in deceptive peace. The trees whispered in the wind, hiding secrets. Every sound in the distance could be a friend or a threat. She moved carefully, crouching as she stepped into the cover of trees once more, knife ready in one hand, makeshift pack of provisions in the other. The sun fell lower, painting the swamp and surrounding woods in golden shadow. Etta pressed forward, stepping lightly over roots, wading through narrow creeks when needed, avoiding open patches that would leave her visible. The air was heavy with humidity, the scent of decay and life intertwined, and then, from the distant field she had seen earlier, a faint cry reached her ears, a shout carried on the wind. The plantation guards, the overseers, were beginning to understand the truth. They were afraid. Etta's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the awareness that this fear was her shield. She was no longer merely a slave running blindly through the night. She had become something else, something powerful. A storm hidden behind silence, a shadow moving through the world that they had thought they controlled. She pressed onward into the trees, every sense alert. Each snapping twig, each rustle of leaves could signal danger. She did not stop to consider rest again. Not yet, not until she was far from their reach. Hunger gnawed at her, but her focus was absolute. By the time the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Etta had covered miles. Her legs were raw, her skin scraped and bleeding, her arms ached, her lungs burned. But the whispers of fear, the stories that were beginning to ripple through the plantation, followed her, unseen, carried on the wind, and she knew they would never forget her. Etta had moved through the forest all afternoon, and by the time twilight painted the world in deep golden shadow, her muscles were screaming in protest. Every step through the underbrush tore at her skin. Every branch scratched her arms and face, and yet she did not stop. The fear she carried was no longer simply the instinct to survive. It had become a living, guiding force, sharper than any knife she had ever held. The distant plantation, her former home, the place she had escaped from, had become a mirror in her mind, reflecting not only danger but also opportunity. They feared her now, whispered her name, and that fear was a weapon she could wield if she was careful. She knew she had to move, to remain unseen yet always ahead, because the hunters would return. They had been humbled by her last acts of defiance, but that humiliation had also made them dangerous, precise and relentless. By the time she reached a small rise overlooking a clearing, she paused. Her chest rose and fell in labored gasps, sweat and dirt streaking her skin like war paint. From this vantage point, she could see the faint lights of another plantation in the distance, not hers, but nearby. A place to rest, perhaps, if she was careful, but it was not empty. Smoke rose from a chimney, and through the half-light she thought she glimpsed movement. Etta did not hesitate. She crouched low, moving through the shadow of trees, taking the paths she had memorized in her childhood when she had followed her father through the woods, learning where the ground was firm, where the roots would trip, where water pooled silently. Each step was calculated. Each snap of a twig could mean discovery, death, or delay. As she crept closer, a voice broke the relative silence, a male voice, sharp and commanding, filled with arrogance. "She's around here somewhere. Spread out." Etta froze. Her ears had grown attuned to the nuances of the forest, the sound of human breath, the shift of weight on dry leaves, the subtle crunch of undergrowth underfoot. All were magnified in her mind. These men were no longer improvising. They were organized. They had learned, adapted, and they were coming for her. Her hand found the cane knife at her side. Its weight was familiar, grounding, the only certainty in a world suddenly brimming with unknown threats. She moved deeper into the underbrush, ducking behind a fallen log, pressing herself flat against damp moss. Her breathing slowed, controlled, though every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She had survived Harris, the first master, then another, and now, if she was not careful, the third would find her. And there he was. The third. He had underestimated her, just as Harris had. just as the others had. But this man was clever, vigilant, and cruel. He had sent men ahead, combing the forest, using dogs to flush her out. Yet despite all their planning, they had not anticipated the depth of her knowledge, the precision of her instinct, or the raw determination in her heart. Etta observed him from behind a tree, her eyes sharp, her mind racing. He walked slowly, hands brushing the leaves and branches in front of him as though he could part the forest with his will alone. His gait was deliberate, arrogant, a man used to command and compliance. And he did not see her. She allowed a faint smirk, feeling the thrill of power cold and steady in her veins. This was her domain now, the shadows, the undergrowth, the quiet spaces that whispered secrets. She had become the ghost in their nightmares, the shadow in their fields. They were hunting her, yet she was always one step ahead. The third man raised his hand suddenly, signaling something to the others. Etta held her breath. One misstep, one sound, and it could be over. Yet her patience and awareness were unmatched. She had waited for this moment, studied the land, and calculated the angles. When the first dog approached, sniffing, Etta froze, hidden by a dense thicket. The dog sniffed closer, then barked once and recoiled suddenly. The men cursed from a distance. Etta allowed herself a quiet exhale. The fear she inspired was growing. Each step the hunters took brought them closer to realizing that she was no ordinary slave. She was a force of nature, a hurricane wrapped in silence, moving through the world unseen but deadly. Hours seemed to pass in silence and careful movement. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that stretched across the forest floor. Etta had slowed her pace, allowing the hunters to think they had lost her. But she had not yet, not ever. She paused beside a creek, drinking sparingly, listening intently to the sounds around her. She could hear distant voices, faint, taunting, as the men continued their organized search. The third man had split his group. One half combed the far side of the forest, while he and a smaller party moved along the trail closest to her. They would soon close the gap. Etta pressed herself against a moss-covered rock, feeling the rough texture bite into her skin, grounding her, sharpening her senses. She thought of her mother's hands, her father's lessons, the silent whispers of other slaves who had survived through cunning and will alone. And then he appeared, the third master, emerging from behind a thick clump of trees, unaware of the shadow that waited just feet away. Etta's knife was ready. Her muscles tensed, coiled like springs. Years of abuse, humiliation, and fear had crystallized into one precise moment of action. She did not hesitate. She struck. The man barely had time to react. His eyes widened in shock, a gasp escaping his lips. Etta moved with fluid precision, the cane knife slicing through the air, finding its mark with devastating accuracy. He staggered, the world tilting around him as he fell. The other men, further away, heard the sound and froze, unsure what had happened. Etta did not wait. She pressed forward, ensuring that the man could not rise, could not follow, could not bring further harm. Her movements were swift, brutal, but controlled. Every strike was calculated, born not from rage, but from the necessity of survival. When it was over, silence descended again. Only the forest remained, indifferent to the blood and fear it now cradled. Etta stood over the fallen man, chest heaving, muscles trembling from exertion. The cane knife, her ever-present companion, glinted faintly in the waning light. She looked around at the empty forest, listening, alert, knowing the others would regroup, knowing the hunt was far from over. Her mind was sharp, calculating. She could not linger here. Every moment increased the risk of discovery. She needed to move, to put distance between herself and the hunters, to find safety before night fell fully. The forest was her ally, but only if she used it wisely. Etta moved again, silently, carefully, her senses heightened. She kept to the shadows, ducking behind trees, slipping through undergrowth, leaving no trace. Her heart raced, not from fear alone, but from awareness of the precariousness of her position. Each step carried potential death. Each breath could betray her location. By twilight she had traversed several miles. Her body was exhausted, every joint protesting, every muscle screaming in protest. She paused beside a fallen log, crouched low, knife at the ready. The distant cries of the hunters reached her ears, but they were fainter now, confused, frustrated, uncertain. The whispers of fear had begun to spread among them, faint yet potent. Etta allowed herself a brief rest. Not enough to sleep, not enough to relax, but enough to regain control over her breath, to steady her trembling hands, to reaffirm the path forward. She was wounded, tired, hungry, but alive, and that was all that mattered. She pressed forward again as night began to settle over the forest. The moon rose, casting silver light across the swampy terrain, illuminating narrow paths she knew by heart. Each step was careful, deliberate. Every sound in the distance was a threat. Every shadow could hide danger. By midnight, Etta had reached a small ridge overlooking a river. Its waters shimmered in the moonlight, decay and foreboding. Across the river lay the faint glow of another settlement, another plantation. She knew she could not cross in daylight, the hunters would see her. But at night, with the cover of shadows and her own cunning, she might be able to reach the other side. Her body screamed for rest. Her stomach roared in protest. Her hands and arms were slick with mud and sweat, and yet she moved, step by step, careful and deliberate, inching closer to the riverbank, calculating, planning. The third attempt had been made, and survived, but she knew the fourth, the final, would come, and it would be worse. Night had fallen fully over the forest, thick and suffocating, yet alive with sound. The river in front of Etta shimmered faintly in the moonlight, silvered and cold, reflecting the dark silhouettes of the trees around her. The air was heavy with the scent of water, mud, and decay. Insects hummed incessantly, and somewhere in the distance an owl cried out, its call sharp and lonely. Etta crouched behind a thick cypress trunk, water lapping faintly at her bare feet, muscles screaming in protest. Her body was battered, bruised, cut, and soaked with sweat, yet every nerve was taut, every sense sharpened. She could feel the weight of the cane knife in her hand, its familiar heft grounding her, anchoring her to the present. The hunters were relentless. They had learned, adapted, but so had she. And now came the fourth. The master who had been whispered about, feared quietly by the others, had made his move. He was known for cruelty, cunning, and a temper that flared faster than lightning in a storm. While the previous three had underestimated her, the fourth had deliberately waited, watching, planning, ensuring he would succeed where the others had failed. Etta had anticipated him. She knew this confrontation would be the most dangerous yet. There could be no mistake. Every step, every breath, every blink mattered. From the shadows, she observed him moving with measured confidence through the forest, flanked by two men, their torches cutting through the darkness in jagged ribbons of light. Their boots pressed into the damp earth, leaving tracks that would later tell the tale of the hunt. Etta's heart thumped steadily, her mind calculating. She had come far, survived more than anyone could believe, and each victory had made her stronger, sharper. But the fourth master was not to be underestimated. He had learned from Harris, from the second and third. He was methodical, patient, and cruel. The river's edge offered her temporary cover. She had considered crossing, but the sound of water over rocks would announce her presence. Patience, she reminded herself. Timing was everything. She moved silently along the riverbank, feet sinking into the wet earth, using the shadows of trees to mask her passage. Her breathing was controlled, her movements deliberate. The fourth master and his men were closing in, their torches bobbing in the distance. Each flicker of light was a signal of their presence, a reminder that discovery could come at any moment. Etta paused behind a cluster of reeds, crouching low. Her muscles trembled from exhaustion, yet she forced herself to focus. The cane knife, heavy and sharp, rested in her hand, ready. She could hear the distant shouts of the hunters, the faint splashes of the river as they searched the bank, unaware of how close she truly was. Her mind replayed the events of the past days, the killing of Harris, the flight through the swamp, the confrontation with the third master. Each had taught her something new, the value of patience, the strength of calculated fear.
Decision of timing. The fourth would be no different.
She waited. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The torchlight grew closer, casting long shadows that danced across the water. Etta's muscles coiled like springs. Her body screamed for rest, for relief, for surrender, but she did not give in. Survival demanded action. Survivor. L demanded strength. Survival demanded cunning. Finally, the moment arrived. The fourth master stepped close to the water's edge, unaware of the shadow crouched just beyond the reeds. His eyes scanned the forest, confident, arrogant, certain of victory. He reached for a branch to steady himself, leaning forward slightly. Etta struck. The cane knife moved with lethal precision, slicing through the air. The fourth master's eyes widened in shock, disbelief etched across his face as he fell backward into the shallow river, water splashing around him. The two men with him screamed and lunged forward, but Etta was already moving, retreating into the shadows, her breath controlled, her step silent. The chaos that followed was immediate. The men shouted, their voices sharp with fear and anger. The water churned as they attempted to retrieve their fallen master. But Etta did not pause. She had predicted their movements, calculated the distance they would need to cover, and had already moved away, deeper into the forest. She pressed forward, each step precise, each movement calculated. The cane knife remained ready, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. She had survived 3 attacks. The fourth had been the most dangerous yet. And she had prevailed. But she knew the hunt was far from over. The fourth master's men regrouped, their shouts echoing through the trees. They would come for her again, more determined, more furious. The whispers of fear that had begun to spread among the plantations would not stop them. They would be relentless, driven by pride, anger, and the humiliation of being bested by a slave they had deemed powerless. Etta's mind raced as she moved. She needed shelter, food, water, anything to regain strength before the next confrontation. The swamp had been helpful, but she could not stay there indefinitely. The forest offered cover, but it could not provide sustenance. She needed a plan, a path, a strategy to survive. Hours passed. The forest changed as night deepened. Shadows stretched and merged, masking her movements, providing cover, yet hiding dangers as well. She encountered fallen branches, pools of stagnant water, and patches of thick mud that threatened to slow her progress. Each obstacle was a challenge, but she met them with determination. Every step was a calculated risk, every breath a measured decision. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, Etta reached a small clearing. The air here was cooler, the ground firmer, and she allowed herself a brief pause. She crouched behind a fallen tree, surveying the area. Her body ached, her muscles screamed, but she was alive. She thought of the fourth master. His defeat was not just survival, it was a statement. He had assumed he could control her, dominate her, break her will. He had failed. And now, the story of her defiance was beginning to spread, whispered among the plantations, carried on the wind. Etta allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had killed 4 men, 4 masters who had tried to take what was never theirs to claim. Each had underestimated her, each had assumed she would comply, each had failed. And with every failure her legend grew, her reputation solidified, and the fear she inspired became a shield as potent as any blade. But the forest offered no comfort. The fourth master's men would not rest, would not forgive, and would not cease until they believed she was dead or captured. Etta knew this. Survival demanded vigilance, cunning, and unrelenting strength. She could not allow herself to falter, not now, not ever. She moved through the clearing, using the cover of trees and undergrowth to conceal her presence. Her mind was a whirl of strategy and calculation. She needed to reach safety, a place where she could recover, where she could plan, where she could continue to survive. The river behind her marked the last boundary of her previous life, the life of fear, subjugation, and endless pursuit. Ahead lay the unknown, fraught with danger but also possibility. Etta pressed on, every step deliberate, every movement precise. The cane knife remained in her hand, ready for whatever threat might emerge. Her senses were acute, attuned to the slightest sound, the faintest movement, the whisper of wind through leaves. The forest stretched endlessly before her, dark and alive. She moved with it, through it, becoming part of its shadows, a ghost among the trees. She would not rest, would not surrender, would not be captured. The fourth master's defeat was not an end. It was a beginning of survival, of defiance, of power forged in the fires of cruelty and necessity. As night deepened once more, Etta found a small, hidden depression in the ground, a natural alcove shielded by trees and thick underbrush. She pressed herself into it, lying flat, knife at the ready. Her body shook with exhaustion, but her mind remained sharp. She allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to feel the forest around her, to recognize the weight of survival she carried. The fourth master's mistake had solidified her legend. The whispers of fear, now reaching distant plantations, had begun to spread. The men would regroup, they would plan, they would hunt, but she would be ready. Each encounter had honed her, sharpened her, and taught her that survival was not merely about strength. It was about awareness, cunning, and unyielding resolve. Etta lay in the shadows, eyes open, listening to the forest. Each sound was a story, each movement a potential threat. She was a slave no longer in the sense they had imposed upon her. She was a force, a shadow, a being of fear and precision, and she would not be broken. Dawn would come again, and with it, new challenges, new threats, and new opportunities. But Etta was ready. She had survived 4 masters, and each had left a mark, on her body, on her mind, and on the hearts of those who had thought her powerless. And she would continue to survive. The forest was alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant cries of animals, the low, steady hum of insects filling the night air. But to Etta, every noise carried a hidden meaning. Each snapping twig, each whisper of wind through the trees, each distant bark of a dog could signal danger. She had learned to listen not merely with her ears, but with her entire body, with instincts honed by necessity and sharpened by repeated encounters with those who sought to take her life. Etta crouched low in her hidden alcove, muscles still trembling from the exertion of the previous night's confrontation. Her arms and legs ached from bruises, scrapes, and the constant tension of survival, yet she refused to rest fully. Every moment of inattention could be fatal. She pressed herself flat against the earth, feeling the rough texture of mud and fallen leaves against her skin, grounding herself in the physical reality of the forest. The fourth master had been defeated, yes, but his men were still out there, organized, determined, and now carrying a personal vendetta that would make them more dangerous than ever. Etta had survived by cunning, by using the forest and swamp to her advantage, but the hunters were learning. Every step she had taken left traces, no matter how carefully she moved, and she knew they would follow. She allowed herself a brief mental tally. 4 masters had tried to claim her, 4 had failed. 1 remained alive, the network of men, overseers, and enforcers, who now whispered of her with a mixture of awe and fear. The whispers were dangerous, but they were also weapons. Fear could be as potent as steel if wielded correctly. The moon had risen high, silver light reflecting off the river she had skirted the previous night. Etta moved along its edge, careful to avoid open patches that might reveal her silhouette. Her bare feet left faint impressions in the mud, but she kept her movements slow, deliberate, and calculated. Every step was a choice, every breath a measure of life and death. Ahead, she could see faint glimmers of light flickering in the distance. The glow of torches, perhaps, carried by the men who hunted her relentlessly. She crouched lower, pressing herself against the underbrush. Her knife was in hand, ever ready, the weight familiar and grounding. She had survived 4 attacks, but she knew better than to assume safety. Survival demanded constant vigilance. Etta's mind ran through scenarios. If she moved directly toward the distant settlement, she might encounter more hunters. If she doubled back into the swamp, she risked slowing her progress and becoming trapped. If she moved through the trees parallel to the river, she could remain hidden, but would need to find food and water. Every choice carried risk. Every choice demanded calculation. She chose the forested path along the riverbank, using the dense undergrowth for cover. Her feet sank into mud and wet leaves, muscles protesting, but she pressed on, keeping her body low, knife ready, senses alert. Every sound could be a warning, every shadow a potential ambush. Hours passed like this, tension stretching her mind to its limits. Her body screamed for rest, for food, for water, yet she continued. Each movement, each decision was measured, deliberate, precise. She could not afford error. She would not afford error. The hunters were closer now. She could hear faint voices carried on the wind, commands shouted, dogs barking, the sound of boots pressing into earth. They were organized, systematic, relentless. They were hunting not merely for revenge, but to reclaim control, to prove that their authority remained unchallenged. Etta pressed herself flat against the ground, breathing shallow, heart pounding. Her knife was ready. She observed the movements of the hunters, noting patterns, predicting routes, anticipating ambushes. Her body was exhausted, every muscle trembling, yet her mind was sharp, calculating, alive with strategy. Suddenly, movement ahead caught her eye. A shadow shifted between the trees, a scout, likely a man sent to flush her out, unaware that she was already observing him. Etta held her breath, body tense, ready to strike. The scout moved closer, unaware of the danger in the underbrush. In a swift motion, Etta sprang. The cane knife flashed in the dim light. The scout's eyes widened in shock as he fell silently into the mud. Etta did not pause. She retreated into the shadows, moving along a narrow game trail, careful to avoid drawing attention. The hunter's cries rose in the distance, confusion and alarm mixing with fear. The fourth master's men had underestimated her again. They had assumed the night would give them advantage, yet she had turned it into her ally, her weapon, her shield. Etta pressed forward, moving through the forest with calculated precision. Her muscles screamed, her body ached, her skin raw and bleeding, yet she refused to stop. Every step was survival, every movement a statement of defiance. She had survived 4 masters. She would survive now, too. The moon climbed higher, casting silver light over the forest. Shadows danced, twisted and merged. Etta moved through them like a phantom, blending into the darkness, unseen, unheard. The hunters were relentless, but she was smarter, faster and more cunning. Each encounter had honed her instincts, sharpened her mind, strengthened her resolve. By midnight she had crossed several miles of treacherous terrain. The forest began to thin, leading to rolling hills and small valleys that offered both opportunity and danger. She paused atop a small rise, scanning the horizon. In the distance she could see the faint glow of another settlement, perhaps friendly, perhaps not. But it was a possibility, a chance to recover, to rest, to plan the next move. Her body trembled from exhaustion, every joint aching, every muscle raw, but her spirit remained unbroken. She had survived 4 masters. Each had fallen to her determination, her skill, her unyielding will. And she would continue to survive. Etta began to descend the slope toward the distant settlement, moving slowly, deliberately, keeping to the shadows. Her knife remained in hand, every sense alert. The hunters were still out there, but she had learned their patterns, anticipated their movements and avoided their traps. She was no longer merely fleeing. She was controlling the battlefield, shaping the hunt according to her will. Hours passed. The settlement drew closer. She could see smoke curling from chimneys, hear faint sounds of life. She pressed on, crouching low, moving through underbrush, careful not to reveal herself. Her body ached, her hands were raw, her feet bleeding, yet she moved with relentless determination. Suddenly, a noise, a twig snapping underfoot, echoed through the quiet forest. Etta froze, knife ready. From the shadows a figure emerged, one of the fourth master's men. He had been waiting, watching, anticipating her movement. Etta's mind raced. There was no time to hesitate. She struck with precision, the cane knife finding its mark. The man fell silently into the underbrush. Etta did not pause, moving again, retreating into the shadows, continuing toward the distant settlement. Her heart pounded, muscles screamed, but her mind remained sharp. She had survived 4 masters. She had evaded countless hunters. She had become a force, a shadow, a phantom moving through the forest, leaving fear in her wake. By dawn, she reached the edge of the settlement. It was small, simple, but offering potential sanctuary. Etta crouched in the shadows, observing carefully. She would move cautiously only when it was safe. Her body demanded rest, food and water, but she would not compromise her safety. Not yet, not ever. The whispers of fear she had inspired among the plantations had spread. Men spoke her name in hushed tones, trembling at the thought of her. The fourth master's defeat had become legend, and Etta, exhausted, battered, yet unbroken, pressed forward into the unknown, ready for whatever lay ahead. She had survived 4 masters, and each encounter had strengthened her resolve. Each moment had honed her skill, sharpened her instincts and solidified her place as a force to be reckoned with. The hunt was not over, but Etta was ready. She would continue to survive, continue to fight, and continue to inspire fear in those who sought to control her. The forest around her was alive, whispering secrets, offering both danger and protection. Etta moved through it, A shadow, a storm, a survivor. She was no longer merely running. She was shaping her destiny, one careful step at a time, one calculated movement at a time, leaving fear and legend in her wake, and the hunt would never stop. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, pale and hesitant, touching the edges of the forest with silver. The world was quiet, yet heavy with expectation, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Etta crouched on a ridge overlooking the distant settlement she had spotted the previous night. Her body was raw from the relentless nights of flight, her muscles bruised, her hands scraped, but every sense was taut, alive. She had survived 4 masters. 4 men had tried to claim her body, her life, her will. 4 had fallen to her determination, her precision, her unyielding spirit. And now, finally, she stood at the threshold of something she had never dared imagine, freedom. Yet, freedom did not arrive quietly. The 4th Master's men were still out there, organized, relentless, and filled with vengeance. She had watched their patterns, anticipated their movements, and avoided them for days. But she knew that today they would act with fury, desperate to restore the control they had lost. Etta took stock of her surroundings. The settlement below was small, consisting of a few cabins clustered around a central fire pit. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, hinting at life and warmth. She noted the positions of the buildings, the clearings, the fences. Every detail mattered. Every calculation could be the difference between life and death. Her cane knife rested heavily in her hand, familiar and reassuring. She had learned to move silently, to anticipate, to strike with deadly precision. Every encounter had honed her instincts. Every fight had sharpened her mind. She was no longer merely surviving, she was controlling the battlefield. Etta descended carefully, keeping to the shadows of the trees. Each step was deliberate, careful to avoid dry leaves and broken twigs. The forest was both ally and adversary, offering cover but hiding dangers as well. She moved like a shadow, blending seamlessly into the darkness, every movement measured. She paused at the edge of the settlement, crouched low behind a thick hedge that separated the cabins from the forest. She could see figures moving between the buildings, men, women, and children, all unaware of the storm that had crept into their midst. Somewhere nearby, the 4th Master's men were searching, their voices low but tense, filled with frustration and determination. Etta's mind raced. She needed a plan, a way to secure her freedom without drawing immediate attention. She observed, noting the positions of the sentries, the patterns of movement, the open spaces and the hidden corners. Every detail was a potential advantage. Every misstep could be fatal. A small group of hunters approached from the forest edge, moving cautiously, weapons ready. Etta tensed, muscles coiled, knife in hand. She had survived countless ambushes, but she knew that exhaustion could betray even the sharpest mind. Her body screamed for rest, her arms ached and her feet were raw, yet she refused to yield. The hunters paused, scanning the undergrowth. Etta waited, every nerve on edge, heart pounding like a drum in her chest. When one of them stepped on a dry branch, she struck with precision. The cane knife flashed in the dim light, cutting through the air and finding its mark. The man fell silently, eyes wide with shock. The others shouted, panic and confusion mixing with fear, but Etta had already vanished into the shadows. She moved quickly, silently, navigating the narrow paths between cabins, keeping to cover, using the structures themselves as shields. The scent of smoke and cooking fires mixed with the forest's earthy perfume, grounding her in the immediate reality. She could feel the presence of the hunters, their frustration growing with each failed attempt to locate her. Etta pressed on, inching closer to the settlement center. She paused briefly behind a large oak, catching her breath, listening intently. The hunters were regrouping, voices low but urgent. They were discussing strategy, unaware that she had already anticipated their plan. Her mind ran through possibilities, calculating each outcome, preparing for any scenario. She moved again, this time with a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. She was no longer fleeing, she was seizing control. Every step, every decision, every movement was deliberate, turning the environment to her advantage. The forest and the settlement became her allies, her terrain, her weapon. By midday, she had reached a small storage cabin on the outskirts of the settlement. Inside, she found supplies, dried meat, bread, fresh water. She ate sparingly, mindful of her limited provisions, and drank, quenching a thirst that had gnawed at her for days. Her body, though battered, was regaining strength, her mind clearer, sharper. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows and illuminating the forest and fields around the settlement. Etta moved cautiously, avoiding open areas, keeping to the cover of buildings and trees. She noted the positions of the hunters, the layout of the cabins, the patterns of movement. Each detail was memorized, catalogued, ready to be used if necessary. Hours passed. The hunters grew more desperate, their movements more erratic, their shouts louder, filled with frustration and anger. Etta observed, noting their tactics, predicting their next moves. She had learned their weaknesses, their tendencies, their overconfidence, and she would use it against them. As dusk approached, the forest took on a deeper, more shadowed quality. Etta moved toward the edge of the settlement, where a narrow trail led into the hills beyond. She had memorized this path from childhood, knew where the ground was firm, where rocks could trip an unwary hunter, where roots could slow pursuit. She pressed forward, moving like a ghost through the twilight. The hunters were close, their voices carrying through the trees, but they were disorganized, frustrated, and fearful. They had underestimated her again, just as the previous masters had. Fear had become her ally, a tool she wielded as effectively as her knife. Etta reached the trail's edge, pausing to listen. The fourth master's men were still searching, still shouting, still desperate. She could hear the distant cry of a dog, the shuffle of boots on the forest floor. Her heart pounded, but her mind was calm, focused, precise. She had survived this long through skill, cunning, and determination. She would survive now, too. She began to move along the trail, careful and deliberate. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. The forest around her whispered with life, insects buzzing, leaves rustling, and distant birds calling. Each sound was a signal, a warning, a guide. She followed it all, moving steadily toward freedom. Night fell fully as she ascended a small hill. From the top she could see the distant lights of a larger settlement, smoke curling from chimneys, the hum of life beyond the forest. She crouched, observing, calculating. This would be her sanctuary, her refuge, the place where she could finally rest, plan, and rebuild. The final stretch was the most dangerous. The fourth master's men would not give up, would not relent. They would track, pursue, and ambush. But Etta was ready. She had survived 4 masters, countless hunters, and the relentless pursuit of those who sought to claim her. She had honed her skills, sharpened her instincts, and embraced the fear that had once been her enemy, now transformed into a weapon. Step by step she moved forward, blending into the shadows, navigating the hills and valleys with precision. Her body ached, her wounds burned, yet she pressed on. Every moment brought her closer to safety, to freedom, to the possibility of life on her own terms. Finally, as the first light of dawn touched the distant settlement, Etta reached the edge of a river that marked the boundary between the forest she had traversed and the world beyond. She paused, looking back at the path she had taken. The swamp, the forest, the treacherous trails, the sites of her confrontations. Each step, each struggle, each encounter had forged her, shaped her, strengthened her. With one final glance at the forest, she stepped into the shallow river, moving carefully across the rocks and water. Her knife remained in hand, ready for any final challenge, every sense alert. The current tugged at her feet, the water chilled her legs, but she moved steadily, deliberately. On the far side, the settlement awaited, a place of potential safety, of recovery, of freedom. Etta emerged from the water, exhausted, battered, but alive. She pressed into the shadows, moving carefully through the underbrush, keeping her senses alert. The hunters might still follow, but she had learned their weaknesses, anticipated their patterns, and now held the advantage. By midday, she had reached the outer edge of the settlement, where a small group of people worked the fields. Etta observed silently, calculating, waiting for the right moment to move forward. She had survived 4 masters, countless hunters, and relentless pursuit. She would survive now. She would thrive. She would live. And as she stepped fully into the settlement, the sun breaking over the horizon, Etta finally allowed herself a long, deep breath. She was free, though the path ahead remained uncertain. Though danger lingered beyond every shadow, she had earned this moment. She had survived. She had fought. She had triumphed. The legend of the most dangerous female slave in Georgia had been forged not in defiance alone, but in relentless action, unyielding courage, and the refusal to surrender. And Etta, exhausted, scarred, yet unbroken, moved forward into a world that could not cage her.